All right, I'm going to provide a quick video here on the explanation for Treeline that hopefully you kind of got to this conclusion from the activity today. So the graphs up here were shown in the paper you read last week, and it just shows the temperature and the ability of different tissues to grow, essentially. So on the left is air temperature and shoot elongation, and then on the right is soil temperature and root elongation. And what you see is that root growth is more sensitive to temperature than air temperature than leaves are or shoots are. So they actually stop growing at a higher temperature. So when we look at more data, the average for where roots stop growing is somewhere around 6 degrees Celsius for the majority of plants. So that's kind of our threshold for what we're looking for in growth of trees or lack of growth of trees. So let's look at some data that spans tree line. So you can see in this upper left-hand picture here that you can see this forested area a little bit lower down. Then up at higher elevation, you can see there's still plenty of green. So this is the alpine area. So there's lots of plants growing, but they're not trees. These are short herbaceous plants. And what you notice is on the center picture, this is an infrared image. The yellow and oranges and red temperatures are higher than the blues and greens. And so this image in the middle corresponds with this picture on the top. And what you see is the alpine areas where there are no trees, the temperature of the canopies is actually warmer than the forested areas, which is a bit weird because the alpine areas are higher elevation, so they should be colder. And indeed, the air temperature is colder, but the actual temperature of the plants themselves is colder at lower elevation. So it's kind of the opposite of what we would expect. And you can see on the bottom figure here, this is actually just the canopy temperature with altitude. And you can see that the plants at the alpine are warmer. They're maybe around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius, whereas the tree canopy is between 8 and 10 degrees Celsius. And if we look a little bit closer, you can see that a lot of the forest temperature is, hovering between 6 and maybe 8 degrees on this. This is a pretty warm day in the summer for this particular site. So this is about as warm as these plant canopies are going to get. And it's 6 to 8 degrees, so it's a little above that threshold of growth. I just realized that my slides, are cut off a little bit, but basically what it asks in the text here is, if the canopy is 6 to 8 degrees, what do you think the soil is below it? Because that's going to be shaded and even colder than the leaf canopy. So now we're talking about, temperatures in the soil that are probably less than that 6 degrees C. So those soils, those plants aren't growing very many roots during the growing season. And then if you were to take that forest canopy and move it up in a higher elevation where it's even colder, then we're going to start crossing that threshold. Okay, but what's should be perplexing is, okay, why is the forest canopy colder even though it's at lower elevation? And I talked a couple weeks ago when we were looking at boundary layer of leaves that we're going to talk about this on a larger scale. And so this is it. Trees, the taller trees, tend to disrupt the boundary layer. And so by disrupting the boundary layer, what I mean is they cause the air to move more. These taller trees kind of stick up into what the boundary layer would be and cause that air to move more. And so you get a really thin boundary layer above the forest canopy. So that's not trapping very much heat. So the leaf canopy of forests is really going to be closely related to air temperature. But in the alpine area, those short plants, they have what we call a smoother surface. Even though it's not super smooth, it's smoother than the forest canopy. That allows the boundary layer to build up much thicker and trap more heat. So that's why we see the leaf canopy being warmer in the alpine. And because the leaf canopy is warmer, that's also going to allow more heat to penetrate into the soil. And so soil temperatures are going to be warmer. So if you look at this image in the middle panel of these three pictures, That's why the alpine area is much warmer than the forested canopy, because it's got a thicker boundary layer above those plants. And so we're talking not a boundary layer around leaves anymore. We're talking about it across the whole landscape. All right. And then that boundary layer above the forested area is going to be much thinner, not trapping very much heat. So then what would happen, if a tree gets established above tree line, which happens sometimes, a seed will get up there, they'll germinate and they'll grow. But what happens is as they start to grow, they start disrupting that boundary layer. The boundary layer gets thinner around that tree and temperatures get colder, and they get too cold for those plants to grow. And primarily, again, it's that soil temperature preventing the roots from growing and getting the nutrients and getting the soil or the moisture that the trees need. And so, this is the most universal explanation of tree line. There are places where avalanches might prevent tree line. There are locations where there might be the right pollinator might not be present. There are situations where other things explain tree line, but in the absence of those things, this explains tree line. So there are locations where there are plenty of pollinators, and there are no avalanches and no rock slides, and all of those things are gone, and we still have tree line. And what's left is this explanation of tree line. So just to look at one data that kind of shows where this tree line is located at globally, this is, or I guess we'll look at two graphs. This shows the elevation of tree line on the y-axis with latitude. And so you can see at really high latitude, so north, very far north, very far south, tree line is going to be, at sea level essentially. So as you move, up into Alaska and parts of Canada, we've got tree line that occurs, without elevation. Of course, the closer you get to the equator, that tree line is going to have to move up in elevation. What's interesting though is, when I first started learning more about this, I didn't really think about there being tree line in the tropics, but there certainly are tree lines in the tropics as well. And so this just kind of shows that general pattern of tree line. If we look at some actual data points, I guess, the x-axis again is latitude. On the left side of this axis, we have mean soil temperature, and that's these black symbols up here are mean soil temperature. And then the green ones are length of the growing season. And so what this is just kind of showing us is that on average, if the soil temperature does not get above 6.4 degrees Celsius during the growing season, that's where trees are going to stop growing. So that's what this kind of dotted line is. 6.4 degrees Celsius of the soil temperature during the growing season. And what's cool is that works regardless of the length of the growing season. You see this kind of bump in growing season length near the equator. It doesn't change this relationship. So it's not how long plants have to grow, it's that temperature threshold is really driving where tree line occurs. And that's the explanation, and I'm done.